I still stick to this view, but it caused a lot of opposition. There were protests about my appointment, and I got that epithet from the pro-life people as the most dangerous man in the world. It was bizarre. I think a crucial thing happened in that I was going to do just a law degree, and a counsellor at Melbourne University looked at my results from my final exams at high school and said, look, you've done well in literature and history and languages. You might find law a bit dry. Why don't you combine it with an arts degree? So I said, great, that sounds like fun. And I'll do history in my arts degree, but you have to do a second major as well. So my older sister had a boyfriend who'd done some philosophy, and tried to talk to him, and that sounded fun. There was no philosophy taught at high schools at all then. So I did philosophy, and I think the reason I wanted to do law was that I quite liked arguing, but in philosophy you can argue as well, and you don't just have to argue for the side that pays you. So there's clearly an advantage. So that's, I think, why I ended up doing philosophy. Those are key pillars.
And your name, of course, is synonymous with animal rights. How did the issue of animal rights come to have such an important role in your life?
Yeah, I'd been studying ethics. I was interested already in some practical or applied issues about in ethics. I had been involved in the protest movements against the Vietnam War, and so I've been interested in issues about when is a war justified, issues about the obligation to obey the law because we're engaged in civil disobedience. And I was also interested in the issue of abortion, which was then in the news in Melbourne because the laws were being enforced. They hadn't been enforced for some years, and then we had a Roman Catholic head of the homicide squad who decided to enforce the laws against abortion. So I wrote about that when I was writing for the Melbourne University student newspaper. So I was interested in those issues, but animals had never really occurred to me as an important issue. And I wasn't an animal lover. I didn't have a pet or anything like that. But in 1970, I happened to have lunch with a Canadian student who I just met at a class, and we were talking about something in the class, nothing to do with animals. But when we went to Balliol College for lunch, to continue the conversation, he asked whether there was meat in the sauce on the spaghetti, and when he was told that there was, he took the salad plate. So I took the spaghetti, and after we'd finished whatever we were talking about, I said, because this is really unusual to meet somebody who doesn't eat meat then in 1970, I said, so what's your problem with meat? And I'm not sure what was in the back of my mind. I thought maybe he had some health reasons against it, or possibly he was a complete pacifist who thought that all killing is wrong. But he said something much more simple than that. He said, I don't think it's right to treat animals the way they get treated to be turned into food. And I said, well, why not? Don't they have good lives? They're out on the fields grazing, and they're protected from predators. They get enough food. And yeah, of course, I know at the end they get transported to slaughter and killed, and that's bad. But, their lives as a whole didn't seem so bad to me. But my new friend said, no, they're being brought inside now, and they're very crowded, and basically whatever is profitable will be done to them. And I was surprised by that. I'd never heard of any of this. It wasn't well known. He referred me to the one book that had been written, Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines, which had been published a few years earlier, but it got very little attention. I read that, and I found the evidence was pretty clear. She gave sources for what she was saying. And I thought, so what is the moral status of animals then? What is it that justifies us to mistreat them in this way, to come into the meat, which I've been eating all my life? And I looked at what philosophers had said. Aristotle, mentioned in the last session, thought that the less rational serves the more rational. But he also thought that this means that it's okay for Greeks to enslave non-Greeks. Kant, who said we don't have duties to animals because they're not self-conscious. But, why should being self-conscious be what matters? Isn't the fact that you can feel pain enough? So I wasn't persuaded by any of that, and I thought, not only should I not be eating meat, but really there's something wrong with the whole way we think about animals, or the fact that we don't think about animals very much as raising ethical issues. And that's when I started working on that topic.
I want to ask you about this shift in recent years to absolute morality. We said earlier we're not going to talk about it as shifting from subjective, because that's not the term you'd use. But can you tell us about that shift and where it's come from?
Yeah, but I don't really want to use the term absolute either. I want to use the term objective. Sorry. That's because absolute has two meanings. It can be used in this sense of morality being objective, but sometimes it's used for the morality that says there are some things that are wrong in all circumstances. So like an absolute morality might say it's always wrong intentionally to take an innocent human life. And I don't think that's always wrong. There's at least imaginable circumstances where I think that it could be defended in order to prevent a lot more innocent human lives being lost. So let's stick with objective and non-objective. I used to think that there was no real objective morality. I think I was influenced by my Oxford supervisor, R.M. Hare, who wrote a number of books on ethics, one of which was called Freedom and Reason. And he thought that there's a sense in which we're free to think whatever we like about morality, and yet he thought there's a role for reason to play in morality. And that was sort of his dilemma. And I don't think that he ever really showed how those two things were compatible or went together. So I was influenced by him in thinking that morality is not objective, that you could call it subjective, or there's some freedom that we have to think what we like about morality. But I tried, after I graduated and as I was a professor, I tried again and again to work out the role that reason could play within this system. And eventually I decided that I couldn't do it. And also around this time, I started working on a book about the late 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick, who was an objectivist. And I did this with a co-author, a Polish philosopher, Katarzyna Lazari-Rodek. And we ended up defending Sidgwick's objectivism. That took me some of the way there to think, okay, there is a possible defense of objectivism, and then, of course, you don't have these problems with showing how reason plays a role in moral argument. I was also influenced by Derek Parfit, the late Oxford philosopher who died 5 or 6 years ago, and Tom Nagel, an American philosopher. So I think there were a number of influences that led me to think that, on balance, their arguments were more persuasive than the views that Hare had put up.
I wanted to ask you about a quote attributed to you that says, any action becomes a duty if it will prevent more pain than it causes or causes more happiness than it prevents. How can you determine this, since pain could be measured either individually or collectively, then the group's interests could be higher than individual interests? So how do you weigh that up?
Right. So, I mean, I think that statement can be defended even if you can't weigh it up, because the statement assumes that you do know that one action will produce more pain than another. And I think there are clearly cases where that's true, right? In fact, I think it's pretty clearly true in the case of rearing animals in factory farms, giving them miserable lives, as compared with, if you like, the pain, or perhaps some people will think it was the loss of pleasure of not being able to eat those particular dishes when there are other things you can eat that will nourish you perfectly well. And, you know, there are many cases where we make decisions, I guess, about what's going to hurt me more or less, right? I've got a bit of a toothache now. If I go to the dentist will probably drill out filling. That's pretty uncomfortable, maybe even painful. But if I don't, the toothache will just get worse. So I am reducing pain by going to the dentist now. So I think there's some cases where you can pretty clearly make that distinction. There's other cases where it's very hard to, and maybe there's some cases you really can't decide. So it's not that utilitarianism can always tell you what you were to do, irrespective of your lack of clear knowledge about comparisons of pains, pleasures. that's a problem then. But it's a problem for anybody who's going to give some account to how much suffering or happiness or pain or pleasure you're causing. And I think we all ought to take that into account. That's why, as I said before, I don't think there's any rules that you can say you ought to stick to no matter what the consequences, because the consequences have to play a role. And I think, even if you think that rights are fundamental, you still would think that to prevent a catastrophe, people who you ought to sometimes violate someone's right if the consequences are going to be so much worse. So we can't really do without making those comparisons or aggregating to some extent.
The New Yorker considered you the dangerous philosopher. Why does it consider you the dangerous philosopher?
I think the New Yorker was repeating things that have been said about me. I don't think the New Yorker was necessarily endorsing that judgment. This goes back to when I was appointed to Princeton. I was appointed to Princeton in 1999. I had already in Australia had some confrontations with an organisation called Right to Life Australia, which was opposed to abortion and was also opposed to euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying. And I'm an advocate both of a woman's right to decide whether she wishes to remain pregnant or not, and of a right to die when you decide that your quality of life has fallen to a level that is not acceptable to you, and it's not going to return to that level. For example, if you are terminally or incurably ill. I've also, perhaps more controversially than either of those, argued that when babies are born with very severe disabilities, parents ought to have also the right to decide whether it's better for their child to live or not. And I developed that argument because I was directing a bioethics centre at Monash University in Melbourne, and we were approached by the director of a neonatal intensive care unit at one of Melbourne's major hospitals about a dilemma that they had with infants born with severe disabilities, where they were contemplating withdrawing treatment from these babies, not treating them, because they, in consultation with the parents, thought that it was better that they should not live, given the severity of the prognosis. But not treating them meant that they died fairly slowly. In some cases, if they needed a respirator, they died within hours. But in other cases where they didn't need a respirator, they might die over weeks or even months. And that seemed a pretty dreadful ordeal. So after listening to the director, I and my colleague Helga Kuzer, who's also working with me at the centre, decided that, in fact, the decision that it's better that the infant not live was a reasonable one. But the method of bringing about the infant's death in the cases where no respirator was needed was cruel to the infants and to the parents waiting for their child to die, and also to the nursing staff who had to care for the infant. So we suggested it would be better if we were allowed to give the child a lethal injection once you made that decision. And that's still a view that I hold. In fact, it is now actually possible to do this in the Netherlands. I think that's the only country where it's possible to do it. But the withdrawal of treatment is going on everywhere in this country as well as others. So I still stick to this view, but it caused a lot of opposition. There were protests about my appointment. That's again another example where I think Princeton University did stand up for freedom of expression despite those protests. And I got that epithet from the pro-life people as the most dangerous man in the world. It was bizarre. I think it ended when 9/11 occurred, and I think Osama bin Laden became the most dangerous man.
Second only to bin Laden, quite reputation.
There were others then too.
Can I just ask you, in order for philosophy not to remain a sort of purely intellectual cogitation, what is the most pressing issue that you see that philosophers need to be addressing in the world today? Not theoretical, the kind of real world need for the application of philosophy.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.